sources that talk about what Greg mentioned, what I mentioned in terms of depression going down. I found something recently, I run into this all the time, Rabbi Nachman Breslov. He writes the following. He says, depression is a terrible scourge. It feeds the evil inclination. Right? This is like, it's like food for the evil inclination. Okay. Joy is the foundation of spiritual strength. As we find written, for delight in God, that is your strength. Okay. Just one example. Rabbi Nachman talks about this all the time. Yeah?
I'm sure you're going to expand on
yes.
Paying attention to feelings, but that can also be a slippery slope, can't it? Because if in today's society, if it feels good,
right. So I have to explain what I mean by the feeling. I need to explain that because I understand you're thinking emotions, and I actually don't mean that. Okay, not exactly. Here's the problem. We talked about the Garden of Eden last time. We talked about the fact that the sin of the Garden of Eden was essentially man creating a world, right? That when we ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what we essentially did, is, according to the Nachash, the serpent, was we would become like God. That was the argument of the Nachash. We would become like God. And Rashi over there, as I mentioned, points out, what does it mean? Let's translate. What did the serpent mean? And he says, Yotzer Olamot. It means that we would create worlds. Okay? And I explained last week that creating worlds means, from the word olam, which means hidden, that we would have the power, just as God creates worlds by hiding, he created the universe by hiding himself, by disappearing, by contracting his presence, so too, we have the power to hide God. What was the result of eating of that tree? Besides the fact that we hid God further. We created a world in which God's presence was more hidden. That's, by the way, that's all that the curses of the Garden of Eden were. You have to understand that. God didn't come along and punish Adam and Eve for eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It wasn't a punishment. It was simple repercussions. He gave them exactly what they chose. They chose to live in a world where God was more hidden. All of the curses are simply what a world where God is more hidden looks like. That's all it was. Okay? But what happened? What changed? What was the mechanism that allowed that to happen? So you see, the Michtav Eliyahu, Rabbi Dessler, explains the following. What was the world like before Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil? What did they live in? What was it? It was a world where there wasn't the knowledge of good and evil? What kind of world was it? Any ideas? What's that?
Free of Yetzer Hara?
Were they able to see God?
What's that?
They were able to see God?
They were able to see God. That's right. In other words, you might make the mistake of thinking these were kind of primitive folks. They didn't have any concept. But it's absolutely clear that Adam and Eve were far from primitive. They were on a spiritual level way beyond anything that we could imagine. After all, they lived in a world where God's voice walked in the garden. That's a very high level of nevuah, of prophecy. So our sages teach us that the world prior to eating from the tree of good and evil, knowledge of good and evil, was a world of sheker and emes. It was a world of truth and false. What's the difference? It was a world of total clarity. Good and evil only exists in a world where you're not so clear, right? It's a world where there's some, it's a downgraded version. It's not truth or false. I mean, it's not like illusion. It's just bad, right? Illusion is a lot worse than bad. Illusion is like it really doesn't exist. It has no real existence. Bad is it exists. It's just not the greatest idea. Prior to eating from this, we had utter clarity, which is an interesting discussion in itself. If we had utter clarity, what did we eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil for? We should have just done what God told us to do, which is another discussion. But we're told that Adam could see from one end of the universe to the other. It was a world that was translucent. There was no getting caught up in the illusion of the physical. He could see beyond the physical. He could see the real, true existence of God behind it. One thing is for sure. It was a world where it was very clear who was talking to them when it came to the dialogue between God and the Yetzer Hara, right? Who was God in that story? God, right? God shows up in person and gives them their marching orders. Eat from this tree, don't eat from that tree. Clear as day. Who shows up and tells them not to listen to God? The serpent, the Nachash, right? Was there any confusion whatsoever as to who was talking? Right? None whatsoever. There's the Nachash, there's God. I know you're going to ask, well, why? So why listen to the Nachash? It's not for today's discussion. But the Miktab Eliyahu points out, what happened when Adam and Eve ingested this fruit? What actually happened? What enabled the world to go from a world of sheker ve'emes, truth and falsehood, to a world of tov v'ra, good and evil? He explains that what happened was, prior to the chet, prior to the sin, it was outside, it was objective. We knew who the Yetzer Hara was speaking, God was speaking. Afterwards, we ingested it. Now the voices are inside of us. We don't know who's speaking. Okay? We don't know who's talking. And by the way, the Yetzer Hara has a way of, very good way of impersonating, right? Impersonating our better selves. The sages tell us the Yetzer Hara is like he moves in, right? And after a while, he's the one it's like he's living in the house and you're living outside. It's like, what do we want to do? It's like, who's talking, right? Joy, boy, that looks really good. To who, right? He takes over, right? We don't know who's talking. And this is why it is such a tremendous problem, what most people tend to do, and what's so tempting to do, which is to start to reason our way around when we are in a low state of mind. Okay? Because we don't know who's talking. We don't realize, we don't know, when we're in a low state of mind, what I call low state thinking, or what I fondly refer to as stinking thinking, okay, happens to look really, really good. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? You know what I'm talking about? Somebody here doesn't know what I'm talking about? Anybody here, has anybody here ever typed a flame mail? Anybody here not use email? Email's a great example. Okay, so you ever find yourself upset in front of a computer? Very dangerous thing, okay? Very little impulse control between you and the keyboard, right? And you're typing one of those emails that you're finally setting somebody straight, right? And if you ever notice how you're feeling when you're typing one of those emails, right? This is good stuff, right? I don't know, but could be a Pulitzer Prize, perhaps. It's right on the nose, perfect. Now, if you are fortunate